We've all had some embarrassing pictures that have come back to haunt us, haven't we? Be it an old photo from our university days in which we are passed out drunk in a gutter, or one from our teenage years in which we are boldly rocking a very dated and rather cringy fashion trend. Truly, there is nothing more humiliating than a poorly aged photo. But worry not, folks, because no matter how embarrassing your old photos are, we can guarantee that the subject of today's video, King Edward VIII's, are much worse. Because here he is, with a big old smile on his face, meeting none other than the ultimate bad guy of history, Adolf Hitler. And that segues us to a claim that is commonly made about Edward VIII, that he was a Nazi. But this claim is a hotly debated one, and so today we shall be getting to the bottom of it. Let's begin. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of Edward's potential Nazism, let's take a moment to consider his wider life. That way, any judgments on his politics can fit into a fully fleshed out perspective of the man. He was born on the 23rd of June in 1894 and was the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary. His early life was typical of many a monarch, being educated at the Royal Naval College, Osborne, before going on to later study at Oxford University, although he did not complete a degree. From the offset, he found himself a popular man thanks to his charisma, gaining himself a reputation amongst the people as a modern and approachable sort, which was a strong contrast to his much more stuffy and old-school father. For this, he quickly became known as the People's Prince. Come the outbreak of World War I, this attitude saw him relinquish the safety of his position and sign up with the army, serving specifically with the Grenadier Guards, and eventually rising to the rank of captain come the war's end. Although note, despite no lack of enthusiasm to get stuck into the enemy, his father did not allow him into combat. Post-war, he travelled the British Empire extensively, giving his popularity an international dimension as he got to ply his charms on a whole new audience. Edward's ascension to the throne came on the 20th of January 1936, following the death of his father. He was met with controversy straight out of the door because his charm and charisma created an adjacent problem: personal conduct unbecoming of a monarch, as the fuddy-duddies of the black and white days would call it. The unbecoming conduct in question was his choice of squeeze, one Wallace Simpson, an American socialite who was not only married, but most shockingly of all, was divorced. Their affair was well known in social circles, but with his attention to the throne, there was only so much that could be done to keep a lid on the matter, and soon enough, the cat came out the bag, and pearls soon found themselves clutched Blighty over. Worse still, however, the situation developed into a full-blown constitutional crisis, as the Church of England, which Edward sat at the head of as supreme governor, did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons if their former spouses were still alive and kicking. Words were had with Edward about the absolute storm he would unleash if he continued to pursue Wallace's hand in marriage, but the warnings fell on deaf ears. He loved her, and that was the beginning and end of it as far as he was concerned. This put him in the crosshairs of both his family and the government, which was then led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. The latter made it clear that both the British and colonial publics would never accept Wallis as Queen, and thus she would create tensions that the empire could ill afford, and the former expressed their fear that Edward's marriage to Wallis would undermine both the monarchy's moral authority and its standing with the public. The situation came to a head in December 1936 when Edward proposed a morganatic marriage which would prevent Wallis from taking the title of Queen. This compromise was rejected by both Baldwin and the colonial governments, however, who insisted that when it came to the monarchy, it was either done properly or it wasn't done at all. This led to them laying down an ultimatum, a bluff of such magnitude that it would make Edward come to his senses, abdicate if he wanted to marry Wallis. The bluff backfired, however, because that's exactly what he did, signing the instrument of abdication and formally giving up his crown on the 10th of December 1936. This was then announced to the public the following day, with him famously saying the following in a radio broadcast to the nation: "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. I now quit altogether public affairs and I lay down my burden." Following his abdication, Edward was given the title of Duke of Windsor and went into exile. His marriage to Wallis took place on the 3rd of June 1937 in a private ceremony in France. And that is where his potential Nazism comes back into the story, because many say that had that abdication never happened, and thus Edward had remained on the throne, World War II could have gone very differently, with a Nazi Edward being able to help Oswald Mosley and his British Union of Fascists secure power, and thus bringing the British Empire into the Axis camp, or being in a position to sabotage the war effort and push for a British surrender once it did break out. With the stakes being so potentially high then, it's vital that we get to the bottom of Edward's Nazi sympathies so that we can say with conviction whether or not such grim alternate realities really could have existed, but for the sake of a single swipe of a pen back in 1936. So then, let's now weigh up the evidence in both directions, beginning with... One of the leading bits of evidence that those who believe Edward did have Nazi sympathies point to is a visit that he and Wallace made to Germany in October 1937. The visit, which occurred shortly after his abdication, saw the now Duke and Duchess of Windsor embark on a highly publicised tour of Germany, and it featured a couple of, well, let's just call them eyebrow-raising moments, to say the least. For example, Edward and Wallace met none other than Hitler himself at his Berghof holiday home in the Bavarian Alps. The meeting itself was a cordial one and is very well documented in photographs that clearly capture the pair in friendly conversation with Hitler. As for what they discussed, the minutes of the meeting appear to have not survived the war, but some say that Edward supposedly encouraged Hitler's policy of Lebensraum, i.e. his territorial expansion into Eastern and Central Europe. From there, they toured numerous Nazi facilities, their new friend in the Führer eager to show them just what his ideology could do when let loose upon a country, and boy, did Hitler do that, because one of the places they visited was a concentration camp. Yeah, you heard me right, an actual concentration camp. Later in life, Edward would claim to have been so blindsided by the positive reception he received that he didn't know what it was, but one can't help but wonder why Hitler would show them it at all if he didn't believe them to be on side. When all was said and done, Edward and Wallace jointly penned a letter of appreciation to Hitler for their visit, expressing that Germany had made a great impression upon us, and further stating that they'd had a wonderful time. Naturally then, from just this trip alone, even the most ardent devil's advocate enjoyer would be hard-pressed not to at least be entertaining the idea that Edward might just have been a Nazi. But wait, there's more, because there's not just that one visit that evidences Edward's potential Nazism, as there's also the so-called Marburg files. These files, which were not made public until 1957, contain documents suggesting that Edward had discussions with the Nazis about potentially returning to the throne as a puppet king under German control. One particularly damning document from the Marburg files is a telegram from a Nazi operative in 1940 claiming that Edward was a firm supporter of peaceful compromise with Germany and believed that continued heavy bombing of Britain would force the country into making peace. But while these files certainly aren't a good look, Edward himself denied the authenticity of the telegrams and some other documents, describing them as complete fabrications. Then there was the British government's initial reluctance to release the files, which raised doubts over their authenticity by some. Churchill, for example, had appealed to US President Dwight Eisenhower to keep the documents hidden for at least 10 or 20 years, suggesting that their contents were considered highly sensitive and potentially damaging to the reputation of the British monarchy. And from that, some have suggested that what was finally released might well be redacted, edited, or even doctored outright. Beyond that, Edward's statements and actions before the war may further highlight his potential Nazi sympathies. For example, in May 1939, he made a recording in which he expressed his desire to avoid war with Germany and advocate for a peaceful settlement.
I speak simply as a soldier of the last war. The supreme importance of averting war will, I feel confident, impel all those in power to renew their endeavours to bring about a peaceful settlement.
This recording, labelled "not to be broadcast," clearly shows that Edward was firmly against entering into conflict with Nazi Germany. That much is irrefutable, but is this evidence enough to condemn him as a Nazi? Here's some more potential evidence to add to the mix in your calculating cauldron. The fact Edward and Wallace were under suspicion of maintaining contacts with Nazi officials when the war had broken out by many of the contemporary powers that be? Take the FBI, for example. They recognised Edward and Wallace as a potentially huge tool for manipulating British opinion, and so they were closely monitored by the organisation, with the surveillance being deemed so important that it was personally overseen by none other than J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau's director. Declassified memos shed more light on the specifics of their suspicions. Many Nazi officials were floated as suspected points of contact, but the man they kept coming back to was Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister. The reason for his being singled out above all others, it was highly suspected that he had had an affair with Wallace in the 1930s, and so as a result of either intentional romantic manipulation by Ribbentrop or the genuine compulsion of Wallace's heart, it was reasoned that if communication did indeed still exist, it was likely through that channel. In one specific instance, an informant in September 1940 even confirmed that Wallace was in constant communication with von Ribbentrop, although do know that this informant's claim had seemingly never been confirmed by other documentation, so take it with a slight grain of salt. Another interesting piece of the puzzle is that while the British government was never concerned enough with Edward and Wallace's behaviour to deal with them, so to speak, they were concerned enough to de facto exile the pair, which they did by appointing Edward to be the governor of the Bahamas in 1940, putting him so far away that it essentially became a moot point how much of a Nazi the pair were or weren't. If they were, then all was well. They were now so far away that both communication with the Nazi government and being installed as a puppet king post-invasion were both all but impossible. And if they weren't, well then the job was actually a good one, wasn't it? As they just have a grand old time of it in a tropical paradise while the war was fought, and return at their leisure after its conclusion. And that pretty much is all the evidence we have for Edward and Wallace being Nazis that we have. Let's now bring this chapter to a close and take a look at the evidence to the contrary. Let's begin the counter-arguments by looking at Edward's personal attitude towards Nazi Germany, which we can firmly describe as being nothing if not ambivalent from what we've seen thus far. Was this necessarily the result of ideological sympathies, or instead was it the end result of personal experiences and pragmatic considerations that made him reluctant to beat the war drum? For example, there was his experiences in World War I, because while he may have avoided getting stuck in chunky style, as he always wanted, he was still a serving frontline soldier, one who took every opportunity possible to shake off the shackles of his position and get involved with out of combat proceedings. As a result, he saw the mountains of lifeless corpses. He saw the wounded young men who were alive only in the most abstract of senses and carried life-altering wounds that would never heal. He ate his bland, tasteless rations and the occasional protein-juicy rat when supplies fell short, and he endured the indignity of having to squirt out his brown stuff into putrid, pestilence-laced latrines, just the same as everyone else who served on the front lines, regardless of whether or not he ever pulled a trigger or shoved in a bayonet in anger. And do you think this experience may have made him just a tad averse to future wars, particularly ones which paralleled World War I so closely? Certainly those who doubt his Nazi credentials do, as they will often ascribe his actions to not his ideology, but to simple, oh-so-crushing trauma responses. But even if we were to ascribe his behaviour largely to a trauma response, there is no getting around the fact that he did admire certain aspects of Nazism. That much we know to be true. But those who doubt Edward's Nazism say that his admiration was more for its practical achievements rather than the ideological underpinnings. Think things like the economy and infrastructure works, both of which, at face value anyway, Nazism did remarkably well with, especially when the UK was still in the perishing grip of the Great Depression. Now today we know that the Nazi economy was but a sham, an entire country essentially living on credit card debt as its recovery was actually financed by MIFO bills, state-issued IOUs that let them defer payment for public works and thus created the illusion of economic recovery, and through the magic of getting absolutely creamed in World War II, these IOUs were never able to be called in, thus creating the waning but still on life support idea that the Nazi economy was actually great. But we're only able to say that because we have 80 years of hindsight and the collective works of hundreds, if not thousands, of historians who have all stood atop each other's shoulders and slowly ratcheted us towards a nuanced understanding of the matter. Edward had none of that. He just saw a country that was outwardly doing really well, as his was doing really badly. This presents two questions for us to consider. Firstly, can he really be blamed for buying into this rose-tinted view of Nazism in full context? And secondly, is this admiration enough to write him off as a full-blown Nazi in and of itself? We'll leave you to answer those questions yourselves. As for a specific historian who comments on the matter, consider Ted Powell, a history professor at Cambridge University and author of works such as King Edward VIII, An American Life, and Kingship, Law, and Society. He believes that Edward was a man torn by duality, his need to fulfill his royal duties and the expectations that the British public had placed upon him, and a more foreign-minded private set of beliefs, but not German ones, no, American ones. Powell even draws attention to different names that Edward went by as evidence of which hat he had on at any given time, so to speak. With his private Americanized name, which was used exclusively by close confidants in casual settings, being David. Publicly, as Edward, he was expected to embody the traditional values and decorum of the British monarchy. This required him to engage in diplomatic activities such as his controversial visit to Nazi Germany, which was, after all, ostensibly a diplomatic mission. According to Powell, his interactions with Nazi officials and even Hitler himself were part of his official duties and reflected the geopolitical landscape of the time, where appeasement and engagement with Germany was seen by some as necessary to maintain peace. These actions, conducted in his public persona, often gave the impression of a more formal endorsement of policies and regimes that he might not have privately supported as strongly. Privately, as David, he was influenced by his experience and personal inclinations, which were significantly shaped by his time spent in America and his relationships there. This Americanized persona was less bound by the rigid protocols of British royalty and more inclined towards personal freedom and informality. These beliefs and values were more progressive and aligned with modernity, contrasting sharply with the traditional expectations of his royal role. This internal conflict manifested in his personal choices, such as his relationship with Wallace. According to Powell, Edward's controversial actions should be evaluated with this duality in mind. Considering that further, Powell goes on to suggest that his public actions were not the result of any kind of Nazi sympathy, but simply him doing his royal duty as he perceived it at the time, and his private, very American and liberal beliefs simply make it impossible that he could have been a full-board, legit Nazi sympathizer. Another thing to consider is the fact that Edward lived another 27 years after the end of World War II, not dying until 1972, so he had a lot of time to explain himself after the fact. So let's see what he had to say. Referencing A King's Story, the memoirs of H.R.H., the Duke of Windsor, which he published in 1947. The first point of note is that he makes no attempts to hide his admiration of German culture, as he says the following regarding a pre-World War I trip to the country. Quote, "Much of what I saw in Germany impressed me. I admired the industry, the perseverance, the discipline, the thoroughness, and the love of the fatherland so typical of the German people. Qualities that were to be found in every calling, in officials and industrialists, in soldiers and workers, in engineers and craftsmen, in the huntsmen who had taken me shooting, and in the waiters who served me steins in the beer halls. I ended in liking Germany so much that I left planning another trip in 1914, little knowing that it would be more than 5 years before I would sojourn there again, and then as a guest of an army commander in the victorious American Expeditionary Force." As for the matter of whether or not this Germanophilia evolved into Nazism, Edward is rather adamant that it did not, and in fact his connection was only ever a pragmatic one, as evidenced by the following quote. "It seemed to me that if there was one man who could prevent a European war, it was Hitler. And I was ready to back him if he succeeded. As for the views attributed to me on domestic affairs, I found it difficult to convince people that I was not in favour of fascism or of dictatorship in any form. My interest in Germany was largely the result of my conviction that Britain must maintain the friendship of Germany if we were to avoid another disastrous war." He also takes the time to address some of his more controversial actions, as you can see here. Quote, "In October 1937, Wallace and I accepted an invitation from Hitler to visit Berchtesgaden. We found the German leader willing to listen to our views, and he assured us that he sought nothing but peace with Britain. We returned to Paris convinced that there was still a chance to avert war." Later, he goes on to discuss it further. Quote, "I tried to point out to my critics that my meetings with German leaders were, in fact, an attempt to gain a better understanding of their attitude towards Britain, and that the invitation to Berchtesgaden had come from Hitler himself through his adjutant, von Ribbentrop. We did not discuss the Jews, nor the Nazi Party's attitude towards them, but we did touch on the international situation. Hitler spoke to me, as he did to many others, of his desire for peace with Britain. But are those comments, and indeed the wider commentary as presented in this whole chapter, enough to salvage Edward's legacy? Well, to answer that, let's move on, start wrapping this video up, and look at everything we've learned thus far to see where we stand. So then, now that we've seen it all, a wider explanation of Edward's life, and both the arguments for and against his potentially being a Nazi, where are we at? Was he indeed a subscriber to possibly the single evilest ideology ever spawned from the minds of man? Or is he simply a victim of historical misreading by that perception? A man who ultimately had good intentions, but just executed them in a way that looks really bad from certain angles? Well, we for one shall not be answering that question. Make no mistake, we have our own opinions on the matter, of course, but today, rather than shoving our own perspectives down your throat, we're far more interested in helping you render your own verdict on the matter. That is an exercise of far greater utility to us all as students of history than any act of persuasion on our part. So, with that in mind, we urge you now to think over everything you've heard today, the meetings of Hitler, the eyebrow-raising comments, the establishment concerns over him, his war experiences, his American streak, and his own post-war denial, and within all that, decide what you think on the matter. And of course, don't forget to tell us what verdict you arrive at down in the comments.